Hello, comrades and non-raids, fellow left tubers and random internet users who stumbled on this video by chance. Welcome to Left Theory TLDR, the channel where we delve into classic leftist theory, mostly from dead Russian dudes, and try to give an overview of it without spending hours of our lives doing so. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's considered to be one of the founding texts, if not the founding text of anarcho-communism. I am, of course, talking about The Conquest of Bread by Pyotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin, or Peter Kropotkin if you're not Russian. The book was first published in 1892 and was originally written in French under the name La Conquête du Pain. We're trying to be relatively speedy here, so I'm not going to dwell too much on each chapter. I'm going to be skipping huge swaths of text. I will, however, be sure to include at least one direct quote in each chapter, and probably more. Even still, I'd like to remind you that this is all my interpretation of the text, and that if you're interested in the contents of it, you should definitely give it a read yourself. The stuff that I leave out might be the stuff that would be the most important to you. So if it's the least bit interesting to you, go have a look yourself. I personally listened to it as an audiobook, narrated by a bloke named Peter Kenny and published by Ukemi Audiobooks. However, there's also a free version of the full text available on the Anarchist Library, which I'll be linking in the description. I invite you to leave your comments if there's something important you feel I've missed, or there's something I might have misunderstood or misrepresented. So this is the introduction and the first chapter. I'll release additional chapters as I make them. At the very end, I'll have a video where I do a summary and identify what I think are some of the main points of the book. I'm not doing any in-depth analysis or anything of the sort. I'd rather leave that stuff up to you guys. Maybe sometimes in the future, but for now, I'm just trying to recreate the text in a slightly more digestible format. With that out of the way, I am Left Theory TLDR, and this is The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. First, let's get the structure of the book cleared up. Alright, so The Conquest of Bread is organized into 17 chapters, each of which has several subchapters. Anywhere from a single subchapter to 7 subchapters. As might be inferred by the title of the book, the chapter which has by far the most subchapters is the 5th one, the one about food, because Peter really likes his bread. Jokes aside, we'll learn soon enough that the importance of keeping people fed during a revolution is a huge part of his whole deal, and much of the book rests on that premise. Also, one of the chapters with only one part is the 7th one, which is about clothing. I don't really know what that means if we're making it into a metaphor for something, but I'm sure a much more witty guy could have made a joke about it. I, however, am just going to mention it and let you make the joke in the comments. Chapter 1. Our Riches. Here, Peter writes about how much stuff is being produced in his time and how rich the world really is in comparison with how relatively poor it had been in the past. He mostly blames advanced technology for this stuff, new inventions and new machines making agriculture and industry much easier and much more productive than it had been in the past. It's worth remembering that he's writing this in 1892, so he's of course referencing the Industrial Revolution, which most historians seem to agree happened in the period between 1760 and 1840. He's mostly delving into how the work of prior generations has made it possible for modern humanity to create a lot more wealth than was possible in the past. He's fanboying pretty hard over technology and progress and thinks it's pretty neat. Quote, "While the hunter of old had to scour 50 or 60 square miles to find food for his family, the civilized man supports his household with far less pains and far more certainty on a 1,000th part of that space. Climate is no longer an obstacle. When the sun fails, man replaces it by artificial heat, and we see the coming of a time when artificial light also will be used to stimulate vegetation." End quote. Later in the chapter, he continues with the descriptions of how much richer we are now, but leans a bit more heavily on the human cost of it. Here's an example. Quote, "For thousands of years, millions of men have labored to clear the forests, to drain the marshes, and to open up highways by land and water. Every rood of soil we cultivate in Europe has been watered by the sweat of several races of men. Every acre has its story of enforced labor, of intolerable toil, of the people's suffering." End quote. Peter then goes on about how absurd and unfair it is that all of this industry and agriculture, which was created by the many, has been claimed by the few in the upper classes. He uses 4 examples late in the chapter, specifically how the soil belongs to a minority, how the mines belong to a minority, how the machines belong to a minority, and how the railways, which would be useless scraps of metal without the labor of the working class, belongs to a minority. Here's the second one about the mine and that 4th one about the railways as an example. Quote, "The mines, though they represent the labor of several generations and derive their sole value from the requirements of the industry of a nation and the cleansity of the population, the mines also belong to the few, and these few restrict the output of coal or prevent it entirely if they find more profitable investments for their capital." End quote. Quote, "The railways, which would be useless as much old iron without the teeming population of Europe, its industry, its commerce, and its marts, belong to a few shareholders, ignorant perhaps of the whereabouts of the lines of rails, which yield them revenues greater than those of medieval kings." End quote. A thing that Peter puts a lot of emphasis on is not just the injustice of this whole system, but also its inefficiency. He's very preoccupied with how little the owning class really understands the kind of work that they're exploiting, and how they're mostly preoccupied with making profits rather than doing it efficiently. The rest of the chapter is mainly devoted to how much work goes into keeping the system afloat, how hurtful it is to society as a whole, and also to individual human beings. He ends the chapter by denouncing the whole system of private property, and he makes a direct appeal to anarchist communism. Quote, "All things are for all. Here is an immense stock of tools and implements. Here are all those iron slaves which we call machines, which saw and plane, spin and weave for us, unmaking and remaking, working up raw matter to produce the marvels of our time. But nobody has the right to seize a single one of these machines and say, 'This is mine. If you want to use it, you must pay me a tax on each of your products,' any more than the feudal lord of medieval times had the right to say to the peasant, 'This hill, this meadow belongs to me, and you must pay me a tax on every sheaf of corn you reap, on every rick you build." End quote. The last sentence written in chapter 1 calls for well-being for all, and that's also the name of the second chapter, which we'll be covering next alongside chapter 3. So, I'll see you then. I hope you liked this video and found it useful to some extent, and I'd like to once again remind you that I'm skipping a lot of stuff to keep this short enough for a somewhat digestible YouTube video. As noted before, there's a link to the full text in the description. I invite your thoughts and feedback in the comment section. If you like what you see, I'd also encourage you to like, subscribe, and share. This is Left Theory TLDR signing off.